It began in the stillness of a valley most people had forgotten existed. Tucked away at the edge of a small rural county, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills, lay a stretch of land that had belonged to the same family for generations. The air always carried the smell of pine and fresh water, drifting up from the reservoir that sparkled like glass beneath the morning sun. It wasn't much to look at for city folks, but for the man who owned it, that land was his peace, his heritage, and his pride. His name was Thomas Hale, though everyone just called him Old Hale. He wasn't old by age, but by the way he carried himself, slow, steady, and with a deep respect for time. The land had been in his family since before the county had a name, long before property lines were drawn with ink instead of handshakes. His great-grandfather had dammed the river that ran through the valley, creating a man-made lake to irrigate crops. Over the decades, it became more than that. It became a boundary, a natural wall dividing the Hale land from the rest of the world. Thomas had spent years maintaining the dam. It wasn't large or fancy, just concrete and steel set into the earth, but it did its job. Behind it, the reservoir collected rainwater and runoff from the mountains, keeping the lower fields fertile even in dry seasons. Below it lay a flat stretch of land, lush and green, where deer grazed in the mornings. It was quiet, untouched, and his. Then one spring morning, things began to change. At first, it was the sound of engines. Not the distant hum of farm trucks or logging machinery. No, these were louder, sharper, and constant. Thomas noticed surveyor stakes popping up along the lower ridge. He watched his men in reflective vests walk the perimeter, measuring, marking, recording. No one spoke to him, and he didn't ask questions. He assumed it was county work, maybe a new road or some maintenance project. But soon the trucks came, big ones with corporate logos and cranes. And when the bulldozers followed, he knew it wasn't a road. It was a development. By midsummer, the once empty field below the dam was stripped bare. The trees were gone, the grass churned into mud. Foundations began appearing in neat, precise rows, one after another. Thomas stood on the ridge watching concrete trucks line up like ants. He tried to convince himself it was temporary, that no one could possibly build on his land without notice. But deep down, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. Weeks turned into months. The skeletons of houses began to rise, framed walls, rooftops, driveways. The noise of hammers echoed through the valley day and night. Trucks brought in materials, power lines were extended, and street lamps sprouted like weeds. Then came the sign. "Welcome to Silver Creek Estates, a gated HOA community." The words hit him like a slap. He drove down to the county office, papers in hand, to prove the land belonged to him. But the clerk, a young woman with no sense of history, told him there must be a mistake. The records showed the land as county-owned, later purchased by a development company named Silver Creek Holdings. His title deed, she said, was too old, outdated, improperly recorded, never digitized. She spoke like it was his fault that his family had trusted paper over pixels. Thomas left that office with a storm brewing inside him. He knew his boundaries, had walked them every year. The developers had built past the creek, past the markers, right into his property. And the worst part, no one cared. The HOA had already started selling homes before the paint on the street signs had dried. By the following year, 35 homes stood where his grazing fields used to be. Neatly trimmed lawns, plastic fences, and identical mailboxes lined streets that had names like Cedar View Lane and Lakeshore Drive. Ironic, since the lake they referred to was his. The dammed reservoir above their perfect homes shimmered quietly, reflecting a peace they didn't deserve. Thomas kept to himself at first. He didn't shout, didn't protest. He filed complaints, sent letters, hired a lawyer, but each time he hit a wall of paperwork and bureaucracy. The developers hid behind shell companies. The HOA claimed ignorance. The county shrugged. No one wanted to challenge the people who brought in tax, revenue, and modern housing. The quiet man with the old deed was just an inconvenience. But Thomas Hale was not a man easily erased. Every morning, he'd walk to the dam, check the gates, and stared down at the subdivision below. The homes looked small from that height, fragile, like toys placed on a board. He noticed how close the backyards crept to the waterline, how they'd built without proper drainage. He knew the soil composition, the water levels, the rainfall patterns, things those developers never bothered to understand. He'd spent years maintaining that dam because he respected the power of what it held back. By the third year, the new residents began to complain about him. They said he was trespassing when he walked along the reservoir's edge. The HOA sent letters demanding he stop loitering near their property. He ignored them. Then they put up signs, private property, no trespassing, as if the land beneath their feet hadn't been stolen. When he tore the signs down, they called the sheriff. He was given a warning. The irony almost made him laugh. Still, he said nothing. The HOA built a small playground near the lowest slope of the dam. Children played there in summer, their laughter echoing up the valley. Parents sat in lawn chairs, oblivious to the history beneath them. The reservoir stayed calm, but Thomas noticed how the dam was aging. Cracks spidered through the concrete, water seeped through old seams, and heavy rains filled the lake faster each year. The maintenance he once performed had stopped when the developers took over. They claimed they had engineers, inspections, certifications, but none of them ever came up there. None of them saw how much pressure was building behind that wall. One night, after a particularly harsh storm, Thomas walked to the dam with a flashlight. The rain had swollen the reservoir to the brink. Water lapped against the spillway, roaring through the channels like a beast behind bars. He stared at the metal gate, rusted, ungreased, trembling under the strain. The whole structure groaned, alive with tension. For the first time in years, Thomas smiled. It was small, bitter, and full of the kind of calm that comes after losing everything. He understood something then, something the HOA, the county, and the developers never would. The land doesn't forget, and the water always finds its way home. As lightning cracked above the valley, he turned toward the dam's control shed and unlocked the door. His father's old keys still fit perfectly in the ignition switch that powered the gate mechanism. The wind howled, carrying the sound of distant laughter from the homes below. Thomas placed his hand on the lever, and in that moment, with the storm raging around him, he knew, one way or another, the valley was about to remember who it belonged to. The storm raged through the night, hammering the valley with relentless rain. Lightning split the sky like torn seams of fire, and thunder rolled across the hills in deep, angry tones. The reservoir swelled higher than it had in decades, its dark surface rippling beneath the flashes of white light. Thomas Hale stood beneath his old shed, soaked to the bone, watching the gauges tremble. He didn't pull the lever that night, not yet. The thought had crossed his mind, heavy and dangerous, but Thomas was not a reckless man. He knew the force locked behind that concrete wall. He knew it could destroy everything in its path, homes, roads, lives. He wanted justice, not blood, but justice had long ago turned its back on him. By morning, the storm broke, leaving behind the kind of eerie silence that only follows chaos. The valley below glittered with puddles, the newly built streets of Silver Creek estates glistening under the washed-out sky. Neatly arranged houses sat quiet, their driveways coated with mud and runoff from the hills. Thomas watched as HOA trucks rolled through the neighborhood, assessing minor flood damage. He saw the smug, suited figures of the board members, shaking hands and nodding, confident their modern drainage systems had done their job. They didn't look up toward the dam. They never did. Weeks passed. The storm became old news, replaced by other concerns. Lawn maintenance rules, property paint colors, late HOA dues. The kind of petty power that fed small minds. But the storm had done more than leave puddles. It had revealed cracks, tiny fractures along the base of the dam, barely visible to the untrained eye. Thomas noticed them first. He always did. He took his time inspecting each one, tracing them with his calloused fingers, feeling the slow seep of moisture pressing through the concrete. The dam was old, strong, yes, but neglected. Without regular maintenance, even the strongest walls surrender to time, and Thomas had stopped maintaining it long ago. The developers had claimed responsibility for the structure when they built their community below. They filed papers, took credit for lakefront property, and used the reservoir as a selling point. Private water access, the brochures had promised. Scenic lake views. Buyers had signed contracts, without ever realizing that the dam had never been inspected since Thomas handed over the keys to the county's care. Except the county never came. No one did. By midsummer, Silver Creek Estates looked like a postcard, white fences, trimmed hedges, children playing under sprinklers. The HOA had become a kingdom of small tyrants. They passed new rules weekly: no trucks after 8 p.m., no sheds over 6 feet tall, no parking on the street. And as if to remind him of his defeat, they sent another notice to Thomas. A letter arrived in his mailbox, sealed with the HOA's logo and written with corporate politeness that dripped venom between every line. It accused him of trespassing on community property, referring to the area near the reservoir. It threatened fines and legal action if he continued unauthorized access to HOA land. Thomas read it in silence. Then he looked up from the paper, across the shimmering lake, to where their tidy backyards reached almost to the water's edge. The arrogance of it all was astonishing. For generations, that water had sustained his family's crops and livestock. Every drop behind that dam had belonged to the Hales. It wasn't just a resource, it was history. The land had memories older than every foundation those homeowners stood on. But to them it was just another feature, something to look pretty in their property listings. And that was when Thomas's patience began to crumble. He didn't act impulsively. He simply began to plan, quietly, carefully, with the precision of a man who understood both nature and consequence. He started by reviewing the old schematics of the dam, blueprints his father had drawn by hand. He marked the weak points, noted the new stress lines, and studied how much the water levels had risen each year. He calculated how long it would take for the structure to fail naturally if left unchecked. But he wasn't going to wait for nature. In early autumn, construction resumed near the lower ridge. The HOA announced plans to expand the subdivision, adding another row of premium lakeside homes. It was almost poetic. They were building even closer to the dam, closer to the danger they didn't even know existed. One evening, Thomas hiked down to the base of the dam under cover of dusk. He carried no tools, no lights, just a quiet resolve. The soil near the foundation was soft from months of heavy rain. He ran his hand along the lowest cracks, feeling the slow, cold seep of water beneath the surface. The pressure was building. Every droplet that forced its way through was like a whisper of warning. The next morning, the HOA received complaints about muddy lawns, discolored water in the retention pond, and minor sinkholes forming near the playground. They sent maintenance crews to investigate. They found nothing significant, just erosion, they said. Nothing to worry about. But Thomas knew better. The dam was tired, and like the man who had built it, it was done holding back. Winter crept in. The valley grew quiet again under a blanket of frost. The lake froze around the edges, its glassy surface hiding the growing instability beneath. The homeowners decorated their porches with lights and wreaths, unaware that the land they stood on was one bad storm away from collapse. Thomas spent those months in solitude, maintaining his small cabin, chopping wood and keeping his silence. But inside him, something had shifted. The anger had settled into a calm, deliberate certainty. He no longer wanted a lawsuit or an apology. What he wanted was balance, and the land, he believed, deserved to reclaim itself. When spring thaw arrived, it came fast and violent. Snowmelt from the mountains poured into the reservoir, raising water levels faster than they had in years. The runoff carried branches, silt, and debris, clogging the spillway, straining the gate. Thomas stood by the dam, watching as water surged against it with primal force. Down below, the residents of Silver Creek enjoyed their weekend barbecues, oblivious. Children rode bicycles along the paved paths, their laughter floating faintly upward to where Thomas stood. He could see them clearly from his ridge, their little world of comfort built upon stolen ground. He didn't hate them. Not personally. They were just pieces in someone else's game. The real thieves wore suits, signed papers, and called themselves developers. But if the valley chose to wash away their mistakes, he wasn't going to stand in its way. That night, the rain returned, heavy, relentless. It beat against the dam with a steady rhythm, echoing like a drumbeat in the hollow valley. The spillway overflowed, water surging through the channels in white torrents. Thomas walked to the shed again, lantern in hand. The wind howled around him. Inside, the old lever waited, rusted, stiff, untouched for years. He didn't hesitate this time. As thunder cracked overhead, Thomas reached out and gripped the handle. His pulse was steady, his expression calm. The storm outside raged harder, rain falling in sheets, the sound of it merging with the deep, distant roar of water struggling for release. He leaned his weight against the lever. The metal groaned in protest. Then, slowly, it began to move. The first gate creaked open. Water exploded through the spillway, cascading down the slope in a violent surge. The roar grew deafening, swallowing every other sound. The valley trembled beneath it. The night filled with the sound of unleashed power, raw, unstoppable, cleansing. Below, the lights of Silver Creek flickered, and in that moment, as he stood watching the flood begin its descent, Thomas Hale whispered to the land that had been taken from him, not in words, but in silence. The water would remember, and soon, so would everyone else. The roar of water tore through the valley like thunder given life. At first, it was only a low rumble, barely noticeable above the sound of the rain, but within minutes it grew into something primal, something that made the earth tremble beneath the polished streets of Silver Creek Estates. The residents awoke to chaos. Water surged down the slopes, a dark wall glistening under flashes of lightning. It carved through yards and fences, tearing up driveways like paper. Storm drains overflowed instantly, and the manicured lawns that once showed off suburban pride became rivers of mud. From his ridge, Thomas Hale watched. The floodlights from the homes shimmered faintly through the sheets of rain, their reflections dancing across the rising water. The dam's gate, now half open, groaned and shuddered with strain. The flood wasn't total destruction, at least not yet. It was a warning, a reminder that nature had no patience for arrogance. By dawn, the damage was undeniable. Half the streets were underwater. Cars sat half-submerged, their alarms wailing into the wind. The HOA's maintenance crew stumbled through knee-deep water, trying to divert the flow with sandbags. Their efforts were laughable, pointless gestures against something far greater than them. The HOA president, a man named Gary Milton, arrived mid-morning, furious and drenched, barking orders through a megaphone that no one could hear over the rushing water. News cameras soon followed. Reporters spoke dramatically about unexpected flooding and drainage failures. They called it a freak storm, an act of God. No one mentioned the dam. No one even thought to look up the valley. Thomas stayed invisible, watching from the tree line. He knew this was just the beginning. The reservoir was still rising. The floodgates were only partially open, enough to send a surge through their streets, but not enough to drain the lake. The dam creaked under pressure, its seams dark and glistening. Every drop that poured down carried history with it. Days passed before the county engineers arrived. They brought clipboards, drones, and hollow assurances. They inspected culverts, tested soil, blamed runoff mismanagement. But when residents began complaining that the lake above seemed higher than ever, someone finally remembered the dam. The HOA board sent a letter to the county office requesting an inspection of the reservoir owned by Silver Creek Holdings. The response came quickly, and it shocked them. The county had no record of ownership transfer. The dam, on paper, was still under the Hale name. For the first time since construction began, they realized the truth. They had built their homes below a privately owned structure, one they had no legal right to manage or even access. Panic followed. Gary Milton and the HOA board drove up the gravel road toward the reservoir, hoping to confront the mysterious owner whose property they had ignored for years. But the path was rough and half washed away by floodwater. Their luxury SUVs struggled against the mud, sliding sideways, wheels spinning helplessly. By the time they reached the top, the storm clouds had cleared and the morning sun had broken through, glinting off the dam's surface like a mirror. Thomas was waiting. He didn't speak to them. He didn't have to. They stood behind the fence, shouting questions, waving papers, demanding entry. He simply watched in silence, the same calm stare that had unsettled men more dangerous than them. Eventually, they gave up and left, cursing under their breath. That night, the HOA held an emergency meeting. They debated hiring lawyers, petitioning the county, even suing Thomas Hale for reckless endangerment. They didn't realize that the man they were trying to intimidate was the same one who had protected that valley long before. Their houses stood there. The irony was bitter. Spring turned to early summer. The water eventually receded, leaving behind a mess of silt, debris, and cracked pavement. Insurance claims piled up. The HOA demanded answers from the developers, but the companies that had built Silver Creek Estates had quietly dissolved years earlier. leaving behind disconnected phone numbers and vanished bank accounts. No one to sue. No one to blame. The homeowners were trapped financially and legally. Their pristine community was now classified as a flood risk zone. Property values plummeted overnight. Banks refused to refinance. Some families moved out, leaving behind empty houses and unpaid dues. Silver Creek estates began to die. But Thomas Hale remained steady as ever. The county sent inspectors to the dam, but they found no structural failure, only age and neglect. They issued mild warnings and left it at that. The reservoir, meanwhile, continued to rise each time it rained. It was almost poetic how nature took its time. The weeds grew tall around the abandoned playground. The smell of damp earth filled the air. Rats and snakes reclaimed the overgrown lots. And still, the HOA tried to hold meetings, enforce rules, and pretend that everything was fine. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Silver Creek was sinking. Not just physically, but in spirit. One humid afternoon, Thomas stood by the dam, looking down at the ghostly reflection of the once bustling neighborhood. The sun shimmered off rooftops that were beginning to show streaks of mildew and neglect. The sound of cicadas filled the air, drowning out the faint hum of generators below. The valley was quiet again, almost as it used to be, except for one thing. The pressure behind the dam had reached its peak. Thomas had opened one gate, but there were 3 more. Each controlled a different outlet, each with the power to unleash another wave. He had built the system with his father decades ago, redundant, strong, patient. It could withstand years of use, but not decades of disregard. The decision weighed on him like the humidity in the air. He didn't hate what he saw below. The people were victims of greed, just like he had been. But they had built their lives on stolen ground, and no one had ever taught them what it meant to respect the land they stood on. That night, as the sky turned a deep shade of red and the first drops of rain began to fall again, Thomas walked back to the shed. He ran his hand over the cool steel of the levers, the hum of tension filling the small space. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. He thought about his father, who had once said that the land takes care of those who take care of. And then he thought about the men in suits, who had called his home unused property. The rain intensified, lightning flashed. He placed his hand on the second lever. The roar that followed was deeper, heavier, more powerful than before. The reservoir heaved like a living creature. A second wave tore down the valley, stronger than the first, devouring everything in its path. Fences snapped, power poles toppled, and driveways vanished under torrents of water and debris. From his ridge, Thomas could see the lights go out, one by one, until the valley below was swallowed by darkness. By morning, the news would spread everywhere. "Dam failure destroys HOA community," the headlines would say. Investigators would rush to assign blame. Reporters would broadcast dramatic footage of the flooded streets, the shattered homes, the wreckage of a place built on arrogance and stolen earth. But Thomas Hale would not be there when they came. He would be gone, leaving behind nothing but the sound of flowing water and the whisper of a valley reclaiming itself. Morning came, but the sun did not rise easily over the valley. Thick clouds hung heavy in the sky, dull and gray, casting a muted light over what had once been Silver Creek estates. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was not destruction alone. It was silence. The kind of silence that follows something too powerful to comprehend. From above, the valley looked unrecognizable. The neat grid of streets had vanished beneath a muddy, shifting mirror of brown water. Roofs jutted from the floodplain like islands. Cars lay overturned, tangled in fences and debris. The playground, the manicured lawns, the carefully planned symmetry, all erased in one night. The dam still stood, cracked, groaning but holding. The reservoir behind it was lower now, drained of its fury, flowing freely through the channels that had once been sealed for decades. The land had taken back what was its own. For the first time in years, the valley looked alive. By noon, helicopters buzzed overhead. Emergency crews arrived in convoys of trucks, wading through waist-deep water to rescue the stranded. News vans parked at the base of the ridge, cameras aimed upward at the dam that loomed over the drowned community. Reporters spoke breathlessly about the unprecedented failure of an unregistered dam and possible negligence by an unknown owner. They would soon learn the name, Thomas Hale. The man whose land had been taken. The man no one listened to. The man who had become a ghost in his own valley, until the valley itself rose to speak for him. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. His cabin stood empty, door open, firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth, as though he had planned to return. Inside on the table sat a weathered envelope. No name, no address, just a folded piece of paper, yellowed and soft with age. On it, in faded ink, was the original land deed, signed by his great-grandfather in 1897. The same document he had brought to the county office years earlier, the one they had dismissed as invalid. Beneath it was another note, handwritten in firm, deliberate strokes. Land remembers. Water forgives nothing. Let it flow. Authorities scoured the hills for him, but there was no trace, no footprints, no vehicle tracks, no signs of struggle. It was as if the man had simply stepped into the fog and vanished. The county declared the area a disaster zone. Federal inspectors arrived to assess the damage. They found that the dam had not failed, but had been deliberately opened. The mechanisms showed signs of manual operation, though no fingerprints or recent tools were discovered. The old control levers, rusted and corroded, were fused in their open position, permanently locked by the force of the flood. The HOA board collapsed. Gary Milton resigned publicly, his face pale and drawn as cameras flashed in his direction. Lawsuits were filed, insurance companies refused payouts, and the homeowners scattered, some to relatives, others to hotels, many to bankruptcy. Silver Creek Holdings, the development company, was confirmed to have dissolved years before construction even finished. The entire community had been built on falsified property records and hollow paperwork. It was, in every sense, an illusion. And now the illusion had drowned. Over the months that followed, the valley slowly began to heal. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind fertile soil where houses once stood. Wild grass began to sprout between the remnants of driveways. Birds returned to the trees, nesting in the skeletons of streetlights. The county debated rebuilding, but engineers warned against it. The ground was too unstable, the flood risk too great, and the ownership too unclear. In time, the land was declared uninhabitable. The HOA dissolved officially, its members dispersing across the state, each one carrying their own version of the story. Some called it sabotage. Some called it vengeance. But a few, those who had lived long enough to understand the valley's rhythm, called it something else entirely: justice. Seasons passed. The headlines faded. The dam remained, weathered but standing. It became a local legend, the kind whispered by locals to outsiders who came asking. They spoke of the man who lived alone in the hills, whose land had been stolen, and who had let the water do what men could not. Some said he still lived somewhere in those woods, watching over the valley in silence. Others claimed he had walked into the reservoir the night of the flood and never returned. But every spring, when the rains came heavy and the streams began to swell, locals noticed something peculiar. The dam's gates, those massive rusted levers, would creak slightly, releasing just enough water to keep the reservoir balanced. Not too much, not too little, just enough. No one ever saw who did it. The new caretakers, young engineers sent by the state, set up cameras, motion sensors, alarms, but nothing ever recorded. The gates would simply move, always at the right time, always with precision, as if guided by an invisible hand. The valley remained untouched after that. Nature reclaimed everything the HOA had stolen. The cracked pavement became overgrown with moss, the playground buried under wildflowers, the fences swallowed by ivy. The lake shimmered quietly under the sun once more, calm and eternal, reflecting the sky the way it used to before men tried to own it. Visitors came from time to time, hikers, wanderers, the curious few who had heard the story. Some said they felt uneasy there, as if the air carried an echo of something ancient. Others said they felt peace, like stepping into a place that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The valley, after all, had found its balance again. Years later, when the county finally marked the land on new maps, they left the area unnamed. Locals simply referred to it as Hale's Basin. No houses, no signs, no fences. Just trees, water, and silence. And every so often, when the wind was right, travelers standing near the ridge claimed they could hear the faint sound of rushing water, like a river flowing through stone. and beneath it, a man's steady footsteps echoing softly on the dam. No one could ever prove it, but those who knew the story understood. The land does not forget, and sometimes it chooses one of its own to remind the rest of the world what happens when greed forgets its boundaries. As dusk settled over the valley, the last light of day glimmered off the calm surface of the lake. Not a ripple disturbed it, not a sound broke its stillness. The world below had learned its lesson, and the land that was once stolen now rested in peace.